Well, if you look at how critical you were with China's handling of the pandemic at the World Health Organization, what's your view on China's role at the World Trade Organization?
Well, what's clear about the whole of the trading environment, as you mentioned, is that it's faced with a new crisis with COVID, but it actually was in crisis. I would argue before COVID, global trade actually contracted in the final quarter of 2019 for a number of factors. The US-China trade tensions was certainly one of those, but we also had seen amongst the G20 countries in general an increasing protectionist trend since the end of the financial crisis. Back in 2009, only 0.7% of the G20's imports were covered by restrictive measures. By the end of 2019, that was 10.3%. Now, so you've got a number of things happening simultaneously. You've got that increased protectionist burden. You've got the US-China trade tensions, and you also have a cyclical element coming from 10 years of growth in the global economy.
Okay, as Director General, how would you resolve the US-China trade tensions?
Well, in a sense, they have to be resolved bilaterally. I think that what's our experience over time, it's that these things tend to be resolved because of the financial cost that they apply to those the parties to those disputes, and it will undoubtedly have a drag on GDP in both China and the US. The fact that they're facing something like 28% average tariffs. The question is, in an economic downturn that we're likely to see post-COVID, is that a burden that the respective governments are willing to carry through? As for the WTO needs to make sure that the rules are being fairly applied. I was in 2018, as you say, as UK Trade Secretary. I did 5 visits to Beijing, 5 visits to Washington, and all the time our argument was that we're on the side of the rules-based system, because the alternative to a rules-based system is a free-for-all, and that would be catastrophic for a number of countries and very difficult for a number of others, including countries in Europe.
Donald Trump says the WTO is the worst trade deal the U.S. has ever signed. Is he wrong? Why is he wrong?
Well, it's not a trade deal. It's a system by which we introduce standardized rules so that we can operate in a more predictable fashion. It's also worth pointing out that the U.S. has won something like 92% of the cases that it has taken to the WTO to prevent unfair competition elsewhere. So I think those numbers are very important to look at. I think it's fair to say that the WTO hasn't brought itself up to date as much as it should have. So we're still lagging behind in areas like e-commerce and on tech trade. But we're still stuck in discussions around agriculture and fisheries, which really do need to be resolved quickly. The point is that all those discussions and all the blockages are political. And my argument is that they are best resolved by a DG who's an elected politician with global experience. Because frankly, in those difficult discussions that you allude to ahead, I think that it's much more likely that a politician with experience rather than a bureaucrat would be able to achieve that.
The Airbus-Boeing dispute has taken 15 years to resolve. How, as DG, would you help make it easier and faster for nations to actually resolve some of these disputes?
It's a key issue, and we have to start by getting the appellate body up and running. We have some ideas how we might do that, which we'll be putting forward as we go through this process during the DG selection. But clearly, it's a nonsense. If you can behave in a way that's against the rules, but it takes years for your competitors to be able to get redress, that is a license for people to behave outside that rules-based system. So we need to bring those timescales way in from where they are at the present time. That will require all the countries involved to agree to new processes. Again, I think that's best brokered by somebody who's used to that milieu.
Liam Fox, the U.S. Trade Representative, Mr. Lighthizer, says you two are very close. Are you concerned that your closeness to the Trump administration could upset China and the EU, who both have veto rights?
Well, I think anyone who's dealt with me in any of these countries will know that I have a reputation of being even-handed. And that Britain has a reputation for being not just a safe pair of hands, but very pragmatic. The DG is not their own country's DG, nor any candidate country's DG. They have to be independent. And that was very nice of Bob Lighthizer to say that we were one of the front runners. But I've always thought there was a big difference in a horse race between being able to identify the front runners and actually putting your money on them. So that's a decision that has to be made in Washington.
What do you think could be reasonably achieved at the ministerial meeting of WTO next year?
Well, I think it needs to recommit to the principles of the system. And I think that we need to get back some of that vision that we had way back in the 90s that enabled us to do such tremendous things. But we will also have to have a practical reset. The issues that you mentioned on things like dispute resolution need to be dealt with. But we'll also need to take stock of where we are post-COVID and how we get the global economy opening up. Because I believe that our best resilience is achieved through diversity of supply and keeping that global economy open in things like food and medicines, remembering that about 17% of all those in our planet today are dependent on an open agricultural system to be able to feed themselves and have food security. So there are a lot of cross-referenced issues between economics and global security, and the ministerial conference next year will have to take cognizance of all of those.